Boundaries. They are how we learn how to navigate the world. They help us distinguish you from me and me from my environment. We are often unaware of them unless they are crossed, threatened, or in some way violated. So they truly are how we help to navigate the world. They are, again, ways to distinguish between me and my environment. They are truly idiosyncratic, and personal boundaries are shaped by those closest to us. They are contextual, fluid, and adaptable. Healthy boundaries allow variation depending on circumstances. There are 5 main types of boundaries. There are physical, which are very tangible. Literally, it's our skin. It is an actual barrier between our internal and external environment. There are emotional or intangible boundaries, which is about the level of trust. We have certain amounts of choice about how this boundary is upheld and expressed. Intellectual or intangible boundaries, beliefs, and ideas. Same here, we have access to choice around them. Our sexual boundaries, both determined in the context of relationship. This boundary is related to the expression of some of our most intimate ways of being. Energetic boundaries are thought of as encompassing the other 4, reflection of our overall way of being in the world. So where do boundaries come from? Both of these graphics here, this show really about what personal boundaries are. There are rigid, porous, and healthy boundaries. And what do boundaries sound like? What do healthy boundaries sound like? So those rigid boundaries help to keep other people out. It's somebody that doesn't ask for help. They can be very protective of information, unnecessarily so. They may seem overly detached. They may avoid intimacy. People that have overly rigid boundaries tend to avoid close relationships, and they avoid possibilities of rejection. They tend to keep everybody out. People that have very porous boundaries maybe overshare information. They may struggle to say no. They might feel responsible for the happiness of others, especially to the detriment of themselves. They may get overly involved in the problems of other people. They may be fearful of rejection, and so they have a tendency to let everybody in. Healthy boundaries are things like saying no without guilt, valuing your own opinion and the opinion of other people, not to the detriment of yourself. It's appropriate sharing, it's communication of wants and needs, not compromising values, and accepting decisions of others, choosing who to let in and who to keep out. So where do boundaries come from? Our boundaries tend to come from our collective experiences. The more positive, the better sense of self. Again, it's related to those that are closest to us, the culture we're raised in, the beliefs and the ways of expressing ourselves as thoughts and passed down information. We primarily learn these things from our family. So our family provides the child with a growing sense of self and safe boundaries. Some of those early life experiences teach us about boundaries through connection with our primary caregivers. There is bonding, which is mutual closeness, attunement, which is a sense of being cared for, and attachment, which I'll talk more about this in another PowerPoint. Failure to connect can create underlying fears or sense of instability. They are also neurologic consequences that can show up relationally. Lack of attunement can create distrust in ourselves, in others, and the world in general. We learn about our boundaries also through our friends. So connections with others outside of our family, boundaries are tested and changed throughout our childhood, especially in relationship to separation and individuation, which is something I spoke of in an earlier PowerPoint, and we'll touch on a little bit in an upcoming one. Another way that we learn about boundaries is through community. the world at large, school, media, religion, occupation, again, the culture and communities in which we have the most interaction, how the world is presented to us, and the way in which we respond. The formation of healthy boundaries, how we gather information about the environment. All of our senses contribute to the formation and perception of boundaries. Again, I talked about the different perceptions in a previous PowerPoint, but just as a little bit of a refresher, there is exteroception, which are those surface receptors, sight, sound, smell, taste, touch. And when one is diminished, the others tend to become heightened in most circumstances. Proprioception has to do with where we're at in space. Neuroception is about neural circuits, distinguishing whether situations where people are safe, dangerous, or life-threatening. It's kind of like a gut reaction to something. This term was coined by Dr. Stephen Porges in 2004 and will be discussed in a later PowerPoint. There is interoception, interoception, and visceroception. So interoception and interoception and interoception are really those senses that detect conditions within the body, where visceroception is perceptions of bodily signals that are arising specifically from the viscera. What are the role of boundaries in trauma? So I will be speaking more about trauma in a later module, but will present these briefly to make the connection between early development and later life health issues. So when there are healthy boundaries and a space to find safety, we learn to trust our environment and those in it. When persons are repeatedly felt or feel threatened, there is the creation of blocks, physical tension, states of awareness. The term hypervigilance, physically, emotionally, and psychologically comes into play here. The fixities or patterns can be physical, emotional, or behavioral ways of being. These are generally not changed through purely cognitive means. The underlying issues related to safety, real or imagined, must be addressed. Beliefs about self and our world. Where boundaries have been violated, it alters our worldview and can deeply affect how we perceive ourselves and the world around us. Conditioned responses, physical, emotional, or behavioral. So kind of think back to some of the work discussed in the PowerPoint about behavioral psychology. These conditioned responses can be related to how we were treated and responded to in our earliest development. Through alterations in our responses can happen at any point in life, and it depends upon experiences. So there is a return to these as an attempt to manage arousal and or feel safe. So unhealthy patterns are survival strategies, and usually with good reason. May not make sense to somebody on the outside, but they make complete sense to the person on the inside. So one thing to remember is that when we are stressed, we will revert back to our most successful survival strategy. These strategies are mostly unconscious adaptations. This goes back to memory consolidation, learning, and conditioning. So treatment for psychological conditions related to boundary violations, like sexual and physical abuse, various forms of neglect, must go deeper than just a cognitive understanding of what happened or a change in actions or attitudes. You must address the underlying issues around a felt sense of safety. It is imperative for healing to ultimately take place. So there is responses to boundary rupture. Fight, flight, freeze, most of us are aware of those things, but there's also fawning or appease, which is a learned adaptation, and then there is dissociation, which is an autonomic response. Violations of physical boundaries can be a violation of the law. A violation of boundaries activate different parts of our brain, and symptoms can show up in different parts of our body. Knowing that body memories can be confusing if there has been a cognitive blocking of a traumatic event or events. So an indication of this is when people make statements such as, I don't remember my childhood, or I only remember third grade, or my childhood was normal, but they are dealing with physical conditions that point to something other than a normal childhood experience. I'll I'll start with fight. So breaking these down a little bit more, to fight for or against something. So if you cannot stand your ground and fight to protect yourself because of your size, age, ability, or beliefs, this response can become blocked, inhibited, and displaced onto others. So physical representation of this are things like issues with the hands, wrists, arms, shoulders, upper back, tight jaw, loose teeth from grinding, panic issues, panic breathing, orthostatic hypotension, literally meaning that your blood pressure drops when you stand up. This is an indication of overstressed adrenal glands from long-standing sympathetic activation, but can also be from certain medications or poor dietary intake. Oftentimes this person will present with slumped or rounded shoulders, anterior head carriage, and just kind of a general inability to relax. Psychologically, there can be a great deal of anger or rage, often as a result of repeatedly being told to or led to believe that you don't get to protect yourself and those you care about. There's a buildup that may get released inappropriately or in an exaggerated fashion. Depression, powerlessness, helplessness, hopelessness, those kinds of things can be about the belief that you don't get to protect yourself, that you don't have the right, or that somehow you lack the ability to be able to stand up for yourself. The natural fight response gets shut down. The conditioned behavior to stop or avoid the aggression gets overridden because of beliefs about oneself. Flight is about moving away from danger or towards safety. The most common response when successful escape is probable. There can be a lot of shame instilled by those around you if you physically run from danger. In certain situations or groups, this is seen as being weak. The physical presentation can be a lack of grounding or feeling in the feet, ankles, legs, and pelvis. Movements may be frantic, disorganized, or jerky. When this action gets thwarted or overridden, there can be a lot of pain or stiffness in the lower extremities. High anxiety may serve people, right? Type A, go-getter, thrill seeker, adrenaline junkie. We live in a culture that praises people for constantly being on the move. The workaholic or the person that seems to have it all is seen as being really high functioning when in actuality something else may be going on, especially when symptoms arise. People with this may lack experiences, lack of sleep, restless leg syndrome, chronic tension, unexplained anxiety. People begin taking medications or drinking alcohol in order to be able to fall asleep. Then they drink energy drinks or other caffeinated beverages or medications to help them get up in the morning and stay alert during the day. Fleeing a dangerous situation generally gives way to an adrenaline rush sensation. The feeling is actually the result of nervous system priming our big muscle groups to be ready to fight or flee. And this sensation oftentimes gets overridden because we didn't get hurt. No bones are sticking out, no blood. But when this sensation is ignored, it can get stuck, which can lead to a whole host of issues related to an incomplete fight or flight response. If we simply shook our arms and legs or jumped up and down or did some other way to activate our big muscle groups, arms and legs especially, it would dissipate the chemicals that were queued up to help us survive. Freeze is an involuntary brainstem reaction. So it is a wise and legitimate defense. This is not a choice response. It can feel literally like one foot is on the brake pedal, one foot is on the gas. You want to move, but you can't. So the stages of this: arrest. That's the first one. This is a big inhale when you get startled, and it's kind of all movement ceases except for the eyes, the orienting system, and respiration. It is high sympathetic, low parasympathetic. Muscles are tense and ready for action. The focus is on locating danger. Detection, the potential for movement, still watchful and attentive, trying to determine if the danger is real, where it's coming from, how close is it, and can I get away? There's a sympathetic charge increases to gather data about threat or search for an escape route. Overload is extreme high arousal, muscle constriction, and readiness. The intensification of the parasympathetic system overrides the sympathetic, making it difficult to move. Again, it's like one foot is on the gas and the other is on the brake. Extreme high arousal, muscle constriction, and readiness. Energy that would have dissipated with a fight or flee gets stuck. Like I mentioned earlier, when the response gets overridden or artificially shut down, there can be long-term consequences. Fawning, which is an aspect of the freeze response. It's also referred to as appease and sometimes referred to as the fourth trauma response. So this is a way to avoid conflict, negative emotions, or re-traumatization. People will often fawn when they are triggered. This means they will go out of their way to mirror someone else's opinions, even behaviors, in an attempt to appease them in hopes of de-escalating a situation or to gain favor. This is that person that never disagrees, or they always back down when faced with conflict. It's the person that wants to be seen as the nice guy. Activation of higher brain centers as a way to figure out, rationalize, respond to someone else's actions in order to protect self and possibly others. Oftentimes in domestic violence situations, this is usually related to the children. In some cases, the children may step in to protect younger siblings or even perceptually weak adults. There can oftentimes be dismissal of perpetrators' actions or excessive apologizing as a way to find safety and calm. Dissociation is a physiologic response to an overwhelming situation. I'll talk more about this in a future PowerPoint. It is different than the freeze response, as people are often unaware that they are doing it. Where freeze is often a physically felt sensation, where dissociation is often an absence of feeling. Please don't confuse this with disassociation. That is an action that is unrelated to this conversation. So the DSM-5, 5th edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, put out by the American Psychiatric Association, lists dissociation under post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD criteria of intrusive symptoms associated with a traumatic event beginning after the event has occurred. It is a reaction in which the individual unconsciously feels or acts as if the traumatic event were happening again, were recurring. There's two specifiers with dissociative reactions, and these can happen in connection to other mental health struggles, which I will talk about in another PowerPoint. There is depersonalization and derealization. Depersonalization is a persistent or recurrent experience of feeling detached from and as if one were outside, like an outside observer of kind of the whole entire process and one's mental processes or even their physical body. Derealization is persistent or recurrent experiences of unreality of surroundings. So that was kind of quick. This is just a little bit of a summary. So recognizing and understanding the role of boundaries in healthy psychological development is truly important to be able to see kind of the big picture about maybe how someone is behaving in response to certain stimuli. Understanding how and why they develop or may not develop is also important in kind of conceptualizing a person's psychological development. How boundaries play a role in trauma and trauma-related disorders is also very important when we talk about, again, psychological development, psychological actions and behaviors, as well as appropriate treatment to figure out and to find out what is going on, what a person might need in order to manage and deal with some of their unresolved issues.